The desert sun hung like a bronze medallion in the cloudless Nevada sky as Ray Nichols wiped sweat from his brow. 23 years of highway construction had weathered his skin to leather, but nothing had prepared him for the Highway 50 expansion project outside Ely. The job seemed simple enough: widen the narrow two-lane stretch that ran past the Sagebrush Motel, a weathered establishment that had seen better days long before Ray was born. "Water break!" Ray called to his crew of 5 men operating the excavators and bulldozers. The machines fell silent, their engines ticking as they cooled in the late June heat. Marcus, the youngest of the crew at 26, approached with a slight limp, a souvenir from a motorcycle accident 2 years prior. "This ground's different, Ray. Too soft in some spots, hard as concrete in others." Ray nodded, having noticed the same inconsistencies. Deserts always got secrets. "Just keep the grade even." The project had been delayed 3 times already, first by permit issues, then by equipment failures, and finally by unexplained damage to their surveying markers. The Nevada Department of Transportation was breathing down Ray's neck to make up for lost time. As the men gulped water from plastic bottles, Ray noticed Hank, a veteran operator with salt and pepper stubble, staring fixedly at the motel across the highway. The Sagebrush's neon sign hadn't worked in years, but its vacancy sign still flickered erratically. "Something off about that place," Hank muttered. Ray followed his gaze. The single-story motel, with its peeling paint and sagging roof, looked unremarkable. Just another forgotten rest stop on a highway that time was slowly erasing. A woman in her 60s, the owner, Meredith Collins, stood on the cracked concrete watching them from behind large sunglasses. "She's worried about the noise affecting her business," Ray explained. Hank snorted. "What business? Seen 2 cars there all week." As the break ended, Ray felt a strange sensation, like the ground beneath his boots had shifted slightly. Dismissing it as fatigue, he signaled for work to resume. The machines roared back to life, biting into the Nevada soil. An hour later, Marcus cut the engine on his excavator and jumped down, his face pale. "Ray, you gotta hear this!" Ray followed him to a 6-foot trench they'd dug for a drainage culvert. Marcus jumped down and gestured for Ray to follow. "Listen," Marcus whispered. Ray stood silent in the trench, feeling foolish. Then he heard it, faint but unmistakable. A whisper that seemed to emanate from the soil itself. "Marcus!" The voice was like sand sliding over stone, barely audible above the idling machinery. Ray looked at Marcus, whose eyes had widened. "It said my name, Ray. Clear as day." "Probably just the wind playing tricks," Ray said, not believing his own explanation. "Let's get back to work." But as he climbed out of the trench, Ray distinctly heard his own name whispered from the earth below. Raymond Nichols. Nobody called him Raymond, except his late mother. By nightfall, Ray couldn't shake the memory of that whisper. He sat alone in room 12 of the Sagebrush Motel, a bottle of Jack Daniels keeping him company. He hadn't planned on staying here. Usually the crew drove the 40 minutes back to Ely, but something about that voice had rattled him enough to want to stay close to the site. The room smelled of cigarettes and cheap cleaning products. The television only picked up 3 channels, and the air conditioner rattled like it was on its last legs. Ray pulled out his phone to call his wife, Janet, but the signal showed only 1 bar. A knock at the door startled him. Ray opened it to find Marcus, looking even more unsettled than earlier. "Sorry to bother you, boss, but I can't sleep. Keep thinking about what we heard." Ray stepped aside, letting the younger man enter. "Probably just air pockets in the soil. Deserts full of cave systems." Marcus shook his head. "It knew our names, Ray." Ray poured a second glass of whiskey and handed it to Marcus. "You ever hear about acoustic mirages? Desert phenomenon. Sound bounces off hot air layers." That wasn't our voices bouncing back. They sat in silence for a moment before Ray asked, "You talked to any of the others about this?" "Hank. He told me to shut up about it, but I saw his face when he was digging near the eastern marker. He heard something too." A soft knock interrupted them. Meredith Collins stood outside, her thin frame silhouetted against the parking lot lights. "Evening, gentlemen," she said, her voice rasping slightly. "Just checking that everything's satisfactory with the room." Ray noticed she seemed tense, her fingers nervously twisting a gold wedding band. "Everything's fine, ma'am." "Thanks." She lingered, glancing between them. "You boys finding everything you need for your project?" Something in her tone made Ray pause. "Ground's a bit unusual, inconsistent." Meredith's expression tightened. "This land's always been peculiar. Been here 30 years and still don't understand it sometimes." "Peculiar how?" Marcus asked. "Just desert things. You know how it is." She forced a smile. "Well, good night then." After she left, Marcus looked at Ray. "She knows something." Ray shrugged. Small-town folk are always superstitious about their land. Later, after Marcus left, Ray lay awake staring at the water stains on the ceiling. The air conditioner had finally given up, leaving the room stifling. He was drifting towards sleep when he heard it again. His name, whispered so close it could have been someone lying next to him. Raymond Nichols. Ray bolted upright, heart hammering. The room was empty. He pressed his ear to the wall, then to the floor. Nothing. When he finally fell asleep, he dreamed of digging with his bare hands through soil that felt like warm flesh. The next morning, Ray gathered the crew before sunrise. No one had slept well. Hank's eyes were bloodshot, and even stoic Diego, who rarely complained about anything, looked uneasy. "We're behind schedule," Ray announced, avoiding mention of yesterday's incident. "Need to finish the eastern drainage today and start compacting the roadbed." Diego cleared his throat. "My excavator's been acting up. Engine dies for no reason." "Check the fuel filter," Ray suggested. "Probably just dust." As the men dispersed to their machines, Hank pulled Ray aside. "Found something yesterday I think you should see." Hank led Ray to a spot about 50 yards from the motel where the ground had been partially excavated. He pointed to what looked like a piece of fabric embedded in the dirt wall of the trench. "Thought it was trash at first," Hank explained, "but look closer." Ray knelt down. What he had initially taken for discolored cloth was actually leather. A leather shoe, to be precise, still containing what appeared to be bone. "Jesus Christ," Ray muttered. "You touch anything?" Hank shook his head. "Left it exactly as I found it. There's more, Ray. Look there." He pointed a few feet away where something white protruded from the soil. Ray felt his mouth go dry. A human jawbone. "We need to call the sheriff," Ray said, standing up. "This is now a potential crime scene." As Ray reached for his phone, he noticed Meredith watching them from the motel parking lot. When their eyes met, she quickly retreated inside. Sheriff Tom Blackwood arrived 40 minutes later, his cruiser kicking up dust as it pulled off the highway. A heavy-set man in his 50s with a perpetually sunburned face, Blackwood had the weary demeanor of a man who'd seen too much in a job he'd held too long. "Show me," was all he said after Ray explained the situation. After examining the remains, Blackwood stood silent for a long moment. "Stop all work in this area. I'm calling in the state forensics team from Reno." "How long will that take?" Ray asked, thinking about his schedule. "Day, maybe 2. Depends on their caseload." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "You find anything else unusual? Anything at all?" Ray hesitated, then decided to keep the whispers to himself. "Just the remains." Blackwood surveyed the motel. "I'm going to have a chat with Meredith Collins." As the sheriff walked away, Marcus approached Ray. "We're not telling him about the voices?" "Not unless we have to," Ray replied. "Let's focus on what we know is real." The crew was instructed to work on the western section, while the eastern area was cordoned off with police tape. But the atmosphere had changed. The men worked silently, shooting nervous glances toward the motel and the covered remains. By mid-afternoon, the Nevada sun had become merciless. Ray was reviewing grade calculations when Diego came running, panic clear on his face. "You need to hear this," Diego gasped, grabbing Ray's arm. Ray followed him to his excavator, where Diego had been digging a new drainage trench, nearly 100 yards from the first remains. "I hit something," Diego said, pointing to the freshly dug earth. "Then I heard it." Ray approached cautiously, peering into the trench. A piece of what looked like human skull was visible in the dirt. And then, unmistakably, came the whisper, Diego Suarez. The forensics team arrived from Reno just before sunset. 2 technicians and a forensic anthropologist named Dr. Sarah Chen. They worked methodically, photographing and documenting both sites before carefully removing the remains. Initial assessment suggests these individuals have been deceased for at least 20 years, possibly longer, Dr. Chen told Sheriff Blackwood as Ray listened nearby. Adult male in the first site appears to be an adult female in the second. We'll know more after lab analysis. Any signs of trauma? Blackwood asked. Too early to say definitively, but she hesitated. The male cranium shows evidence of blunt force trauma. Ray watched as they placed the bone fragments into evidence containers. His crew stood in a tight group near their equipment, speaking in hushed tones. Your crew can resume work tomorrow, Blackwood told Ray. Just stay clear of the marked areas. With all due respect, Sheriff, Ray replied, I think we need to do a more thorough survey before continuing. There could be more remains. Blackwood studied Ray's face. Something you're not telling me, Nichols? Ray hesitated, then sighed. My men are hearing things. Voices. To Ray's surprise, Blackwood didn't laugh or dismiss him. Instead, his expression darkened. What kind of voices? Whispers, coming from the ground. They're saying our names. Blackwood was silent for a long moment. I'm going to speak with Meredith Collins again. In the meantime, suspend operations until tomorrow. As twilight descended on the desert, Ray found himself once more in room 12 of the Sagebrush Motel. The crew had unanimously decided to stay another night rather than return to Ely. Safety in numbers, though none of them articulated it that way. Ray sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the wall-mounted phone. On impulse, he picked up the receiver and dialed the motel office. Sagebrush Motel, Meredith answered on the second ring. Ms. Collins, it's Ray Nichols. I was wondering if I could ask you some questions about the property. A pause. I've told the sheriff everything I know. I'm sure you have, but my crew and I are experiencing something unusual. I thought you might have some insight. Another long pause. Meet me in the office in 5 minutes. Udisum. The motel office was a small room with wood-paneled walls and a counter made of laminate designed to look like marble. A coffee pot that had seen better days sat on a side table, and a rack of faded brochures advertised attractions that had likely closed years ago. Meredith Collins stood behind the counter, a cigarette trembling between her fingers. You're hearing them, aren't you? She asked without preamble. Ray nodded. How did you know? Because I've heard them too, for years. She took a long drag from her cigarette. It started small, just whispers I couldn't quite make out. Then names, my name, my husband's name before he left, guests' names. Who are they? Ray asked. I don't know, but I think they're the same people your crew found today. She stubbed out her cigarette. This motel wasn't always called the Sagebrush. Back in the 70s it was the Sundowner, owned by a man named Victor Chambers. What happened to him? Disappeared in 1978. Police investigation went nowhere. I bought this place in 1992 from a bank after it had sat vacant for years. She pulled a manila folder from beneath the counter. Found these hidden in the office wall during renovations. She slid several Polaroid photographs across the counter. Ray felt his blood run cold. The photos showed the motel parking lot decades earlier. A man, presumably Victor Chambers, stood proudly next to a classic car. But it was the background that caught Ray's attention. A mound of freshly dug earth behind the motel, in the exact area where they were now expanding the highway. I think Victor buried them, Meredith whispered, and I think there are more. Sheriff Blackwood called an emergency meeting at dawn. Ray and his crew gathered at a folding table set up near the police tape, joined by Dr. Chen and 2 deputies. Based on new information and the discovery of human remains, we're expanding the investigation, Blackwood announced. The Nevada Bureau of Investigation is sending a team with ground-penetrating radar. They'll scan the entire area adjacent to the motel property. Ray noticed Meredith standing in the doorway of the motel office, watching. She hadn't mentioned their conversation to the sheriff, and Ray hadn't either. Not yet. "What about our project?" Ray asked. "Suspended indefinitely," Blackwood replied. "State's already working on a detour plan." The crew exchanged glances. Normally, a work stoppage would trigger complaints about lost wages, but nobody protested. They were eager to leave this place. Dr. Chen cleared her throat. "We've made some preliminary findings on the remains. The male victim had defensive wounds on his forearm bones and multiple blunt force traumas to the skull. The female victim shows signs of strangulation." "Homicides," Blackwood confirmed. "And based on clothing fragments and a partial driver's license found with the female remains, we believe she may be Evelyn Martinez, reported missing in August 1977. "Any ID on the male?" Ray asked. "Not yet," Chen replied. "But dental records may help once we compile a list of missing persons from that era." As the meeting disbanded, Ray approached Blackwood. "Sheriff, there's something you should see." Ray led him to the motel office, where Meredith reluctantly produced the Polaroids. Blackwood studied them carefully. "Why didn't you bring these forward years ago?" he demanded. Meredith's hands trembled as she lit another cigarette. "I didn't know what they meant. Just thought it was construction or landscaping." "And the voices? When did those start?" Meredith looked away. "About 5 years after I bought the place. Thought I was going crazy at first." "Why stay?" Ray asked the question that had been bothering him. "Nowhere else to go," she replied simply. "Invested everything I had in this place. Besides," she hesitated, "they don't mean harm. The voices, they just want to be found." By mid-afternoon, the NBI team had arrived with their equipment. The ground-penetrating radar was mounted on what looked like a lawnmower chassis, systematically pushed back and forth across the soil in a grid pattern. Ray watched from the motel parking lot as the technicians huddled around a monitor, pointing at anomalies in the data. More police vehicles arrived, along with a news van from a Reno television station. Marcus joined Ray, his expression grim. "They've found more, haven't they?" Ray nodded. "Looks that way. I keep hearing them, Ray, even in my room last night. They know we found the others. They're excited." Ray had heard them too, a chorus of whispers that had grown more insistent, almost eager. Names he didn't recognize mixed with those he did. His own name repeated like a mantra. "You know what's weird?" Marcus continued. "I'm not scared anymore. It's like they're thanking us." Before Ray could respond, one of the NBI technicians approached. "Mr. Nichols, Sheriff wants to speak with you." Blackwood stood by an area where the radar had detected anomalies. His face was grave. "We've identified at least 7 more potential burial sites," he said without preamble. "And we found this." He held up an evidence bag containing a rusted key ring with a rabbit's foot attached. "Recognize it?" Ray shook his head. "It was found near one of the anomalies. The tag says Room 12. Ray felt a chill despite the desert heat. Room 12. His room. The excavation began at dawn the next day. State police had set up a command post in the motel parking lot, and the entire area was now cordoned off with crime scene tape. Media vans lined the highway, their satellite dishes pointed skyward. Ray and his crew had been asked to stay, partly as witnesses and partly because their equipment was needed for the careful excavation of the sites, identified by the radar. "Never thought I'd be digging graves instead of roads," Hank muttered, as he delicately maneuvered his excavator to remove the top layer of soil from one of the marked areas. By noon, they had uncovered 3 more sets of remains. Dr. Chen and her expanded team worked methodically, documenting and collecting evidence before the bones were removed. The process was painstaking and somber. Ray noticed that the whispers had changed. They were no longer just names but fragments of sentences, still too faint to fully comprehend, but growing clearer. Found us, finally. Tell them about the room. He's still here. Sheriff Blackwood approached Ray as he supervised the excavation. Need to ask you something, Nichols. Any of your men report seeing anyone unusual around here? Maybe someone watching the work? Ray thought for a moment. No, just Meredith. Why? One of my deputies found fresh cigarette butts behind your equipment shed. Same brand Chambers smoked according to old reports. Could be from anyone, Ray suggested. Lot of people smoke Marlboros. Blackwood didn't look convinced. Maybe. Still, keep your eyes open. As the day progressed, the death toll mounted. By sunset, they had recovered remains from 6 different sites, with at least 2 more identified for excavation the following day. Preliminary findings suggest all victims died from homicidal violence, Dr. Chen told the assembled law enforcement officers and Ray's crew during an evening briefing. Based on clothing styles and personal effects, all appear to date from the mid-1970s to early 1980s. Any connection between the victims? One of the NBI agents asked. Too early to say definitively, but 5 of the 6 had out-of-state ID or personal effects. Possible travelers passing through. Ray thought about the motel's location. Isolated on a remote stretch of highway, the perfect place for travelers to stop for the night. The perfect hunting ground. After the briefing, Ray returned to room 12, unable to bring himself to leave despite knowing its grim history. The key with the rabbit's foot had belonged to a victim found in one of the graves, a young man named Timothy Brewer, according to a wallet found with his remains. As Ray sat on the edge of the bed, he felt a sudden drop in temperature. The whispers began again, but this time with perfect clarity. He kept trophies, a male voice said, seemingly from everywhere and nowhere. In the walls, behind the mirror. Ray approached the large mirror mounted on the wall opposite the bed. It was secured with screws at each corner. Using his pocket knife, Ray carefully removed the screws and lifted the mirror away. Behind it was a crude opening in the drywall, revealing a small cavity. Ray shone his flashlight inside and felt his heart skip. The space contained a collection of personal items, watches, rings, necklaces, wallets, souvenirs taken from victims, and wedged in the back, a small leather-bound book, a diary. Victor Chambers wasn't just a killer, Sheriff Blackwood said grimly. He was a monster. The diary had revealed the full horror of what had transpired at the Sundowner Motel. Chambers had meticulously documented his crimes, dates, names, methods of murder, and where each body was buried. The entries spanned from 1974 to 1981, describing in clinical detail the deaths of 23 travelers who had the misfortune of checking into his motel. But there are only 9 burial sites on the radar, Ray pointed out, as they sat in the command post, the diary sealed in an evidence bag on the table between them. According to the final entries, he started moving bodies, Blackwood explained. Got worried about construction plan near the property, was going to relocate all of them, but then the entries just... Stop. What happened to Chambers? Ray asked. That's the million-dollar question. Last confirmed sighting was September 1981. His car was found at the Las Vegas airport 2 weeks later, but no record of him boarding any flights. Could he have been a victim himself? Ray suggested. Someone who escaped? Came back for revenge? Blackwood shrugged. Possible. Or he could have just disappeared, created a new identity. Man would be in his 80s now, if he's still alive. The excavation continued for 3 more days, yielding a total of 12 sets of remains. The story had made national news, with the Sagebrush Motel dubbed the Desert Charnel House by one cable network. Meredith Collins had been questioned extensively but ultimately cleared of any involvement. The property records confirmed she had purchased the motel in 1992, long after Chambers had disappeared. What happens to this place now? Ray asked her as they watched forensic teams scouring the motel rooms for additional evidence. Insurance will pay out something, But not enough. She sighed. Doesn't matter. Couldn't stay here now knowing what happened. Couldn't sleep with all those voices. You still hear them? She nodded. They're louder now, clearer, but different somehow. Less desperate. Ray knew what she meant. The whispers had changed, becoming almost peaceful. The names were still there, but the urgent quality had diminished. They were being found. Their stories would be told. On the final day of the excavation, as Ray supervised the restoration of the site, he found himself alone near the spot where the first remains had been discovered. The voices had been silent all morning, but as he knelt to examine the compacted soil, he heard a single whisper, "There's one more." Ray froze. "Where?" he asked aloud, feeling foolish but compelled to respond. "Room 12, under the floor." That evening, Ray requested a final inspection of room 12. Sheriff Blackwood, exhausted but thorough, agreed. They brought in a cadaver dog, which immediately alerted near the bathroom. The vinyl flooring was carefully removed, revealing a concrete slab. It looked undisturbed, but the dog remained fixated on the spot. "Could be a false positive," one of the technicians suggested, "or trace evidence that seeped through over time." "Break it up," Blackwood ordered. It took nearly an hour to carefully break through the concrete. Beneath it, they found a shallow grave and a set of remains. Unlike the others, these bones were accompanied by a rusty revolver and a motel ledger. "I'll be damned," Blackwood murmured as he examined the ledger. Last entry is signed by Victor Chambers, September 18th, 1981. Dr. Chen conducted a preliminary examination of the remains. Adult male, consistent with someone in their 40s. Gunshot wound to the right temple, appears self-inflicted based on powder residue on the bone. Ray thought about the voices that had led them here, to this final revelation. He killed himself. "Looks that way," Blackwood agreed. "Question is, why bury himself under the floor? Why not just shoot himself in the open?" "Maybe he wanted to disappear completely," Ray suggested. "Or maybe what?" Ray hesitated. Maybe he heard them too. The voices of those he killed. Maybe they drove him to it. 1 month later, Ray stood at the edge of the newly paved highway. The expansion project had finally been completed, though the original route had been slightly modified to avoid the area where the remains had been found. The Sagebrush Motel was gone, demolished after being declared a crime scene and then condemned. All that remained was a concrete slab and a few broken pieces of furniture that the salvage crews had deemed worthless. The media frenzy had gradually subsided as the investigation confirmed what they already knew. Victor Chambers had murdered at least 23 travelers between 1974 and 1981 before taking his own life. His remains had been positively identified through dental records, closing the case officially. 19 of the victims had been identified through DNA and personal effects. 4 remained unnamed, known only by the whispers that had led to their discovery. "Penny for your thoughts," said a voice behind him. Ray turned to see Sheriff Blackwood approaching, looking more rested than he had in weeks. "Just thinking about them," Ray replied. "The voices." Blackwood nodded. "Chen thinks it was some kind of infrasound phenomenon, desert winds creating vibrations in the hollow spaces around the bodies." "You believe that? Makes more sense than ghosts." Blackwood shrugged. "Though I've stopped ruling anything out these days." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the sun begin its descent toward the western mountains. "You still hear them?" Blackwood finally asked. Ray shook his head. "Not since we found Chambers. It's like they were waiting for him to be exposed, for the truth to come out." "Poetic," Blackwood said without sarcasm. "But I'm glad it's over." "Is it, though?" Ray gestured toward the empty lot where the motel had stood. "A memorial's going up next month. People will stop, read the names. The story will live on." "That's different. That's remembrance." Ray wasn't so sure. As a highway safety engineer, he knew that roadside memorials often became focal points for unexplained phenomena. Drivers reporting strange sights or sounds near the markers of tragic deaths. "What about the others?" Ray asked. "The 4 we couldn't identify." States setting up a dedicated tip line. DNA profiles are in the national database. Someone out there knows who they are. As Blackwood walked back to his cruiser, Ray remained at the roadside. The new asphalt gleamed black in the fading light, cutting through the desert like a scar that would never fully heal. He thought about the new travelers who would pass this way, unaware of what lay beneath the ground just yards from where they drove. Would they feel something as they passed? A chill, a whisper, a presence. Ray had declined all media interviews and told his crew to do the same. Some stories weren't meant to be exploited for 15 minutes of fame, but he had agreed to help with the memorial design, insisting that all the victims' names be included, even the unnamed, who would be memorialized as known only to God. As twilight deepened, Ray walked to his truck. Just before opening the door, he paused, listening intently. The desert was silent except for the occasional passing car and the soft rustle of sagebrush in the evening breeze. No whispers, no voices calling his name. Yet as he drove away, Ray couldn't shake the feeling that something remained unfinished, not with the victims or with Chambers, but with the land itself. As if the desert had witnessed the horrors and absorbed them, becoming a repository for memories too terrible to fade completely. Ray switched on the radio, turning up the volume to drown out his thoughts. But between stations, in the static and silence, he could have sworn he heard his name one last time. Not desperate or pleading now, but grateful. Thank you, Raymond Nichols. 6 months later, Ray sat in his living room in Ely. A newspaper spread out on the coffee table before him. The headline read, "Desert Killers' Victims Finally Laid to Rest." The story detailed the funeral service held for the 19 identified victims of Victor Chambers, their remains finally returned to families after extensive DNA testing and identification. Janet brought him a cup of coffee, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You okay?" Ray nodded, though they both knew he hadn't been truly okay since the Sagebrush Motel project. He'd returned to work, but something had changed in him. He'd become quieter, more introspective. He startled at unexpected sounds and sometimes woke in the night, convinced he'd heard someone whispering his name. "There's a dedication ceremony for the memorial next week," Ray said, pointing to a smaller article. "They want me to attend. Are you going to?" Ray hadn't been back to the site since the highway was completed, had purposely taken local projects that kept him close to Ely. "I think I need to," he finally answered. For closure. The memorial had been erected on a small turnout adjacent to the highway, where travelers could safely pull over. It consisted of a simple stone wall with a bronze plaque listing the names of the victims and a brief description of the events. Funded by a combination of state money and private donations, it had become something of a pilgrimage site for true crime enthusiasts and the morbidly curious. On the day of the dedication, Ray arrived early, before the officials and the media. A light dusting of snow covered the ground, unusual for this part of Nevada, even in January. The memorial stood stark against the winter desert, the bronze plaque gleaming dully in the morning light. Ray approached slowly, reading the names inscribed in the metal. 19 names, followed by 4 unknown victims. Below the names was a simple inscription, "May they find the peace in death that was denied them in life." As Ray stood before the memorial, he became aware of someone nearby. Turning, he saw an elderly woman bundled against the cold, placing a small bouquet of flowers at the base of the plaque. "Did you know one of them?" Ray asked gently. The woman straightened with difficulty. "My sister, Eleanor. She was driving to California in 1976. We never knew what happened to her until—" She gestured toward the plaque. "Until they found her here." "I'm sorry," Ray said, the words feeling inadequate. "Were you involved in finding them?" she asked. Ray nodded. "I was the project manager for the highway expansion. My crew and we discovered the first remains." The woman studied his face. "The papers said something about voices. that workers heard voices coming from the ground. "Just rumors," Ray said automatically, the response he'd given to all media inquiries. "Was my sister one of them?" the woman pressed. "One of the voices?" Ray hesitated, then decided this grieving sister deserved honesty. "I don't know which ones we heard. But yes, there were voices. They led us to the bodies." The woman didn't seem surprised. Eleanor always was persistent. Even as a child, she wouldn't let things go until they were made right. She touched the plaque gently. "Thank you for listening to her." As the woman walked away, more people began to arrive for the ceremony. Officials in suits, media with cameras, curious locals. Ray stood apart, watching as the gathering grew. Sheriff Blackwood spotted him and made his way over. "Didn't expect to see you here, Nichols." "Felt like I should be," Ray replied. "How've you been?" "Managing." Ray nodded toward the growing crowd. "Quite a turnout." "People are drawn to tragedy," Blackwood observed. "Always have been." As the ceremony began, Ray listened to the speeches from the governor's representative, the head of the state police, and a spokesperson for the victims' families. Words about justice, closure, and remembrance echoed across the desert. When it was over and the crowd began to disperse, Ray remained, waiting until he was alone once more with the memorial. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the barren landscape. Ray placed his hand on the cold bronze, tracing the names with his fingertips. "I hope you found peace," he whispered. As he turned to leave, the wind picked up, swirling the light snow around his feet. And carried on that wind, so faint he might have imagined it, came a chorus of whispers. Not his name this time, but a simple message. "We have. Thank you." The 10th anniversary of the discovery at the Sagebrush Motel arrived with little fanfare. The memorial remained, now weathered by a decade of desert sun and winter storms, but the story had faded from public consciousness, relegated to occasional mentions in true crime documentaries or podcasts. Ray had retired from the Nevada Department of Transportation 3 years earlier. At 65, his body could no longer handle the physical demands of construction work, and the nightmares that had plagued him since the Sagebrush project had never fully disappeared. He and Janet had moved to a small house on the outskirts of Ely, where he spent his days tending a garden and building furniture in his workshop. Simple, tangible tasks that kept his hands busy and his mind focused on the present. But on this anniversary, Ray felt compelled to return to the site one last time. He told Janet he was going fishing at Cave Lake, not wanting to worry her with the real destination. The drive along Highway 50 brought back memories with each passing mile. The landscape had changed little, the same vast stretches of sagebrush and distant mountains, the same unforgiving sun beating down on the asphalt. When Ray reached the memorial turnout, he was surprised to find another vehicle already parked there, an older model sedan with California plates. As he pulled in beside it, he saw a woman standing before the bronze plaque, her hand resting on the metal, just as his had done a decade earlier. Ray approached slowly, not wanting to intrude on her moment of reflection. She turned at the sound of his footsteps, mid-30s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that carried a weight beyond her years. "Sorry," Ray said, stopping a respectful distance away. "I can come back later." "It's all right," she replied. "I was just finishing." As she turned to leave, something in her expression made Ray pause. "Did you know one of them?" he asked, echoing the question he'd asked the elderly woman 10 years before. The woman hesitated. "My mother," she finally said, "Eleanor Campbell." Ray felt a jolt of recognition. "Your grandmother came to the dedication ceremony 10 years ago." Surprise flickered across her face. "You were there?" "I was part of the crew that found them," Ray explained. "Ray Nichols." Her eyes widened slightly. "You're him, the foreman who heard the voices." Ray shifted uncomfortably. "News reports exaggerated a lot of things. But you did hear something, didn't you?" Her tone wasn't accusatory or mocking, just genuinely curious. "Grandma always believed Mom somehow called out to you." Ray considered deflecting again, as he had with so many others over the years. But standing here, at the site where it all began, the truth seemed to matter more than his comfort. "Yes," he admitted. "We heard voices, names whispered from the ground. It led us to the remains." She nodded slowly. "I was only 4 when Mom disappeared. I don't remember her at all, just what Grandma told me." She gestured toward the plaque. "When they identified her remains, it answered questions but created new ones. I've spent years trying to understand who she was, why she was traveling alone, what brought her to this terrible place." "Did you find answers?" Ray asked. "Some. Old letters, photos, stories from people who knew her." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph, offering it to Ray. "This is her." The photo showed a young woman with a bright smile and the same dark hair as her daughter, standing next to a 1970s-era car. Ray studied it carefully, trying to connect this vibrant person with the bones they had unearthed from the desert soil. "She was driving to San Francisco," the woman continued. "Had a job offer there, a chance at a new life." Ray handed the photo back. "I'm sorry for what happened to her." "Thank you." She hesitated, then asked, "Have you been back here often?" "Not in 10 years, Ray admitted. Today felt important somehow. They stood in silence for a moment, the desert wind rustling through the sagebrush around them. "Do you still hear them?" she finally asked. "The voices?" Ray considered the question. The nightmares had persisted for years, dreams of digging through soil that felt alive, of whispers that called his name from deep within the earth. But the actual voices had stopped the day they found Chambers beneath the motel floor. "No," he answered truthfully. "They found their peace once the truth was known." She nodded, as if this confirmed something for her. "Grandma used to say that the dead don't really leave us until their stories are told. That's why I've been gathering everything I can about Mom. Photos, letters, memories from her friends. I want her story to live on, not just how she died, but how she lived." "That's a good way to honor her," Ray said. As they talked, Ray noticed the sun beginning its descent toward the western horizon. Soon the desert would be bathed in the golden light of late afternoon, then the deep blues and purples of twilight. "I should get going," the woman said, glancing at her watch. "Long drive back to Reno." "Safe travels," Ray replied, the phrase carrying more weight here than it might elsewhere. As she walked to her car, she turned back. "Mr. Nichols, thank you, not just for today, but for finding her, for listening when no one else could hear." After she drove away, Ray stood alone at the memorial. The bronze plaque, weathered by a decade of desert elements, still clearly displayed the names of the victims. Ray's fingers traced the inscription for Eleanor Campbell, thinking of the daughter who now carried her story forward. The sun continued its descent, casting Ray's shadow long across the ground. The desert had begun to cool, the heat of the day giving way to the chill that always followed sunset in this harsh landscape. As he turned to leave, Ray felt a subtle shift in the air. Not a physical change, but something more intangible. A sense of completion, of cycles coming full circle. The whispers that had haunted his dreams for a decade seemed to fade completely, replaced by a profound silence that felt not empty, but peaceful. Ray took one last look at the memorial and the empty space beyond where the Sagebrush Motel had once stood. The land showed no trace of the horrors it had witnessed. Nature and time had reclaimed it, erasing the physical scars, if not the memories. "Goodbye," Ray whispered, not to any specific spirit, but to all of them. The 23 souls who had found their final rest here, and to the younger version of himself who had first heard their calls for justice. As he drove away, the setting sun cast the desert in a golden glow that transformed the barren landscape into something almost beautiful. Ray rolled down his window, letting the cool evening air fill the truck. For the first time in 10 years, he felt truly unburdened, as if in coming back to this place one last time, he had finally released something he'd been carrying since that first whispered name had risen from the Nevada soil. The highway stretched before him, empty and inviting. Ray turned on the radio, humming along to an old country song as Ely grew closer. He would tell Janet about where he'd really been today, share the story of Eleanor Campbell's daughter, and the photograph of a young woman with her whole life ahead of her. It was time to speak these things aloud, to let his own story be told, because some stories, even the darkest ones, needed to be spoken to finally be put to rest. Just as the whispers from the ground had needed to be heard, acknowledged and answered. The desert kept its secrets well, but not forever. And as Ray Nichols drove home through the gathering dusk, he felt certain that the ground beneath the Nevada highway would remain silent now, its grim story finally told, its dead finally at peace.